Welcome to this academic lecture series. This video is produced to analyze international political dynamics, diplomatic security, and political criminal psychology from an objective academic perspective. It aims to evaluate the potential strategic responses of the U.S. administration toward foreign policy stickiness and institutional shifts, offering scholars and viewers an analytical framework grounded in international affairs. If you find this content insightful, please subscribe, share, and like to support our ongoing research and educational outreach. Session U.S. Surgical Sanctions Against Foreign Policy Stickiness. This lecture provides an empirical and psychological analysis regarding the probability of personalized surgical sanctions being deployed by the U.S. Donald Trump administration. This scenario assumes a hypothetical situation where a South Korean left-wing leader ignores repeated U.S. warnings and doubles down on unilateral platform regulations, gag laws, targeted suppression of U.S. enterprises such as the Coupang incident, and judicial capture, including laws penalizing judicial distortion. Should a regime persist with such measures, the U.S. administration is highly likely to launch surgical sanctions targeting core leadership and complicit enforcers directly rather than immediately resorting to blanket statewide sanctions. From the perspectives of international political psychology and foreign trade policy, the estimated probabilities for each targeted sanction instrument are as follows. Section 301, Super 301, Trade Retaliation Tariffs, 95%. Visa suspensions and travel restrictions, travel ban, 85%. Magnitsky Act-based financial and human rights sanctions, 65%. Detailed breakdown of targeted sanction probabilities. 1. Section 301, Super 301, Tariff Retaliation, 95%. This is the most definitive and immediate instrument available, perfectly aligned with the core ideology of America First and trade deficit reduction under the Trump administration, with the United States Trade Representative, USTR, already signaling formal inquiries. Any persistent refusal to recalibrate domestic policy makes retaliatory tariffs almost inevitable within the latter half of 2026. This serves as the presidential executive's most potent weapon, operable without complex congressional procedures. 2. Travel restrictions and visa revocations for specific officials, 85%. Entry bans and visa revocations represent a card the U.S. government can execute far more swiftly and discreetly than asset freezes under the Magnitsky Act. The U.S. Department of State maintains blacklists of ruling party lawmakers who pass legislation harmful to U.S. interests, prosecutors directing targeted investigations, biased judges, and police executives involved in unauthorized crackdowns, revoking existing visas or denying new applications, inflicts immediate psychological and practical pressure, severely impacting foreign asset management and family, educational prospects abroad. 3. Magnitsky Act, Human Rights and Anti-Corruption Sanctions, 65%. The Global Magnitsky Act freezes U.S.-based assets and blocks financial transactions for individuals involved in severe corruption or human rights violations. Potential targets include political figures, orchestrating fake news regulatory laws, financial authorities suppressing media outlets, raising election integrity concerns, and judicial or law enforcement leadership overreaching their mandates. Applying this to an allied nation's public officials carries substantial diplomatic fallout. However, if Washington assesses that media suppression and judicial degradation have crossed into autocratization, targeted sanctions against 3 to 5 core figures carry a 65% probability. The U.S. administration's phased roadmap and priorities, synthesizing the hawkish dispositions of key cabinet members, such as Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and the psychological narrative of President Donald Trump. U.S. Sanctions will not be an emotional outburst. Instead, they will follow a highly calculated, phased roadmap, transitioning from maximizing economic self-interest to diplomatic and security strangulation. Phase 1, economic tariff retaliation and investment enforcement, driven by Section 301 and transactional realism. The U.S. will first leverage Trade Act Section 301 to impose high tariffs on key exports. President Trump operates as a transactional realist, focused on visible capital and employment rather than abstract ideology. Amid delays in promised $350 billion foreign direct investments, out of a broader $950 billion scope, targeted pressure on U.S. firms serves as prime leverage to demand immediate investment fulfillment. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick would similarly enforce these demands without delay. Phase 2, targeted individual travel sanctions and visa denials, driven by Secretary Marco Rubio's ideological stance. Concurrently with economic pressure, the State Department would execute travel bans against judges, prosecutors, police officials, and politicians executing toxic domestic policies. Secretary Marco Rubio maintains an uncompromising stance against authoritarian erosion of the rule of law, much like excluding compromised entities from transnational counterterrorism discussions. The administration will swiftly isolate individuals involved in institutional subversion as anti-democratic enforcers. Phase 3, Magnitsky asset freezes and alliance demotion, financial isolation and diplomatic exclusion. If policy stickiness persists, long-term, individual sanctions will escalate to asset freezes within U.S. jurisdiction and total exclusion from U.S. financial networks. At this juncture, a regime becomes entirely excluded from military intelligence sharing, resulting in diplomatic isolation accompanied by technical legal enforcement. Seizing foreign assets to offset administrative fines imposed on U.S. technology firms. Psychological profiles of key U.S. decision makers. The severity of these potential sanctions stems directly from the distinct psychological and political characteristics defining the Trump administration's foreign policy leadership. Donald Trump president. Trait transactional leadership paired with tit-for-tat retaliatory psychology. Behavioral pattern. Immediate punishment for non-compliance with agreements and extreme intolerance toward perceived personal slights. Analysis. Viewing alliances through a business partner lens. Initial investment commitments are viewed as major political achievements. If domestic political considerations lead to delays or reneging on these commitments, it is interpreted as personal betrayal. His psychological framework dictates punitive retaliation, aimed at returning multiple folds of damage to the counterparty. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State. Trait uncompromising anti-communist ideologue. Zero tolerance for the degradation of human rights and democratic values. Behavioral pattern precision. Targeting of authoritarian enforcers via visa bans and financial freezes. Analysis drawing. From a background that recognizes how populist movements dismantle judicial and media integrity, Rubio views excessive digital control laws in line with totalitarian censorship. Consequently, he favors surgical, Magnitsky-style precision sanctions, targeting specific lawmakers, regulatory heads, and judicial enforcers to deliver a clear ideological message. Those who undermine democracy cannot access U.S. soil or the U.S. dollar. Trade leadership. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and USTR Jamison Greer. Trait hardline protectionists enforcing strict adherence to trade agreements. Behavioral pattern. Direct deployment of Section 301 tariffs to enforce compliance and trade commitments. Analysis. Viewing regulatory fines on U.S. corporations as arbitrary expropriation of private capital. Trade officials are inclined to bypass protracted diplomatic rhetoric, utilizing Section 301 measures to penalize primary export sectors, like automobiles and semiconductors. Strategic implications of diplomatic isolation. When domestic political insecurity leads a political actor to double down on self-defeating policies, the U.S. administrative apparatus responds through synchronized economic tariffs and individual sanctions. This represents a confluence of transactional commercial pressure and ideological accountability. Public officials and enforcers who offer excessive loyalty to short-term political power face personal ruin, lifelong travel bans, frozen international assets, and restricted global mobility. Ultimately, foreign policy isolation undertaken to protect political self-esteem culminates in economic vulnerability and targeted international pressure. The structural dynamics of the foreign policy establishment demonstrate that policy stickiness under these conditions inevitably yields precise and compounding systemic consequences. As an ancient Eastern maxim warns, he who delights in deceit and abuses power to silence others shall eventually construct his own prison, and he who ignores wise counsel invites swift ruin upon his house. Doshing Bugi, Bi Zi Lei. When governance strays from fundamental principles of justice and institutional integrity to serve ego or factional interests, external reality inevitably imposes its correction. Thank you for watching this academic presentation. Please remember to subscribe, share, and click like to stay updated with our latest analytical lectures. Your thoughtful comments and academic feedback are always welcome below. What are your thoughts on the strategic balance between domestic policy, sovereignty, and international alliance commitments?